Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today because we're about to dive into some truly surprising and honestly totally counterintuitive views held by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. We're going to look closely at their actual historical writings regarding taxation, the state, and economic development. If you think you already know exactly where these 19th century thinkers stood on the size and funding of the government, well, get ready, because the primary sources paint a picture that might just turn your assumptions completely upside down.
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? The common modern assumption is usually that Marxist theory advocates for a massive, heavily taxed government bureaucracy that controls every aspect of society. But when we look impartially at the actual source texts, their letters, their articles, and the drafts of Capital, we find something entirely different. We're going to explore exactly how they viewed the state, why they despised high taxes, and how they believed a minimal government was actually the key to rapid economic progression.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. 1. The government machine. 2. Feeding the bureaucracy. 3. The cheap government model. 4. Tactical progressive taxes. And 5. Abolishing indirect taxes. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. The government machine and taxes as the engine.
To really grasp where they're coming from on taxation, we first have to understand how they defined the state itself. The texts show us that Marx viewed the state not as some benevolent, productive entity, but essentially as a separate machine. And what fuels that machine? Only extraction. As he famously wrote, taxes are the economic basis of the government machinery and nothing else. A government doesn't actually create wealth. It simply takes a portion of the surplus value created by the productive economy to keep its own gears turning.
And this brilliantly illustrates their broader definition of the state apparatus. It's almost like a giant puzzle. The source material describes the state almost like an organism that's separated from civil society. It relies entirely on taxation just to maintain its executive power. For Marx and Engels, a strong government and high taxes were considered completely identical concepts. And importantly, they saw this heavy, highly taxed apparatus as something that frequently hindered rather than helped the economic progression of a nation. Which brings us to Section 2, feeding the bureaucracy, or the tax eaters. So if taxes fueled a machine, who exactly is operating it and consuming that fuel? The texts draw a super clear division here. On one hand, we have the productive forces. This includes industry, the accumulation of capital, and the workers who actually produce goods. On the flip side, the texts identify the unproductive classes, the bureaucracy, the standing military, and the clergy. According to these historical documents, these groups do not create value. They simply consume the surplus value created by the productive forces. They are, quite literally, tax eaters. The historical texts are incredibly clear on this point. Listen to this quote. Taxes are the source of life for the bureaucracy, the army, the priests, and the court. In a word, of the whole apparatus of the executive power. The source material frequently uses the analogy of a parasite here. The state bureaucracy is described as a parasitic growth attached to the body of civil society, clogging its pores and draining its vitality through taxation. So what is the crucial takeaway here? It's that funding these unproductive sectors severely limits a nation's potential. Think about it. Bureaucrats produce no new value. Standing armies take strong, productive hands away from industry. All of this wastes the exact capital that is desperately needed to modernize an economy and build real infrastructure. In their view, every single time the state expands, it chokes civil society by draining the capital required for real industrial development. All right, Section 3, the cheap government model and maximizing accumulation. Now, if a heavily taxed state is just a parasitic drain, what was the proposed solution? Well, it was a concept they called the cheap government. This was a historical model that Marx highly praised, particularly when he observed the attempts of the Paris Commune. The definition is exactly what it sounds like, a radical reduction in public spending achieved by tearing down the standing army and dismantling the bloated state bureaucracy. It's all about making the cost of running a society as cheap as possible. The texts actually advise a surprisingly minimal state. The steps are pretty straightforward. First, strictly limit state expenses. Second, simplify the organism of government so it requires way fewer personnel. And third, have the government interfere as little as possible in the affairs of civil society. Paradoxically, to what a lot of folks assume today, they advocated for this minimal state specifically to speed up free competition and industrial development. Why did they want this? Well, because a smaller state shrinks the tax burden on productive capital. When your capital isn't being drained by the government, it can be pumped right back into technology, mass production, and factories.
According to these 19th century theories, this accelerates free competition and hastens the natural phases of economic development. They wanted society to advance through industrialization as fast as possible, and a cheap government was basically the ultimate shortcut to clear the path. Moving on to Section 4, Tactical Progressive Taxes as a Political Weapon. Okay, this brings us to a really fascinating historical puzzle. You might be wondering, wait a minute, if Marx and Engels despised high taxes and bloated governments so much, why did they famously include a demand for heavy progressive taxation in the Communist Manifesto in 1848? It seems like a massive contradiction, doesn't it? Well, the historical sources reveal a strategic breakdown behind that demand. It was a tactical move, not a permanent economic ideal. The steps were basically a political chess match. Proposed progressive taxes as a way to attract the middle class and the petty bourgeoisie, who also hated the big landowners. The ultimate goal wasn't to fund some permanent welfare state. The goal was to use the tax code as a weapon to ruin the old, feudal landed aristocracy that was holding back modern industrial development in places like Germany. The sources are quite explicit about this. Progressive taxes were a tactical political weapon. In fact, Marx later wrote that the progressive income tax was essentially a demand borrowed from the petty bourgeoisie. Once the old feudal systems were destroyed and industrial capitalism could actually flourish, the progressive tax had served its political purpose. It was never meant to be the end goal of the whole shebang. And finally, Section 5, Abolishing Indirect Taxes, or the War on Hidden Costs. So, while they used progressive taxes as a temporary political weapon, there was one type of tax they despised with absolute unwavering consistency: indirect taxes. These are things like sales taxes, consumption taxes, tariffs, or taxes on basic goods. The texts compare them really sharply against direct taxes. Indirect taxes are hidden. They are regressive because they hit the poor the hardest, and they artificially increase the prices of everyday goods. Direct taxes, on the other hand, are completely transparent. They are painful, for sure, but because they are painfully obvious, they actually spark citizen control of the government. Marx argued that indirect taxes purposefully hide the true cost of the state from the individual, writing that they, quote, destroy all tendency towards self-government. Because indirect taxes are quietly rolled into the price of food, fuel, or wine, the citizen just doesn't realize how much the government is extracting. Think about it. If the state had to hand you a direct bill for its armies and bureaucrats, you would immediately demand control over how your money was spent. To summarize their intense opposition, they actually called consumption taxes on food and wine a reverse progressive tax because it multiplied geometrically with the poverty of the consumer. They argued it encouraged merchants to adulterate their goods just to offset the tax cost, and it required a massive, costly bureaucracy just to collect it at the city gates. In fact, their hatred for this system of extraction was so strong that during the Revolution in 1848, Marx literally called for a tax strike in the Rhineland, urging citizens to completely starve the government machine by just refusing to pay. So, what does this all mean for us today? I'll leave you with this final provocative thought. How do these 19th century theories on taxation, capital accumulation, and the bureaucratic state challenge our understanding of modern politics? The historical sources reveal an absolute disdain for bloated bureaucracies, a desire for a cheap government to accelerate economic growth, and a fierce warning against the hidden costs of consumption taxes. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning those historical assumptions, and I will see you next time.